Whoever you are who's watching this video, prepare yourselves for an adventure most fantastic. I was just gonna wreck your video for a second. Yeah.
My research project for Advanced Scriptwriting Workshop was about the industry and position I'm most interested in pursuing, writing for video games. The project started out with a focus on using a screenwriting or creative writing background to get into the video games industry, but ultimately, the most useful and interesting information I found was about how writers function in the production process. I took deep dives in my research into how writers are involved in making video games, what are important skills to know and master, and what differentiates the interactive medium from writing linear narratives like film, TV, or prose. I encountered many roadblocks in my research. Often, the most accomplished games writers are in very public positions and are therefore less likely to respond to inquiries for a student project. Ultimately, however, there are many online written testimonials about games writing, and this information, combined with 2 interviews I secured from the UCF faculty, coalesced into a project that I feel is useful for any aspiring games writer. Both of the interviewees brought a different perspective, and each had interesting things to say.
Hi, my name is Gideon Shabib. I'm an instructor at the School of Visual Arts and Design. Aside from having a master's degree in interactive technology focusing on video game development, I spent a good amount of time contracting for large studios, doing level design and world building, working directly with writers and narrative directors.
So my name is Peter Tellup. I'm an instructor in the English department, and I teach a class called Writing for Video Games. And the lovely Kevin Smith is here to talk to me about his questions and his concerns and dreams of writing for the video game industry. And I'm happy to answer his questions.
Depending on the size of the studio, of course, it's going to vary, but most commonly I think you would see that the writer is going to interact with the creative director and with the design team, trying to figure out what needs are present right now for the game to be able to link the story plot points that they're trying to establish through gameplay, how they would narratively construct that, and how the creative director wants to represent the characters in the environment. So a lot of discussion, and then probably going back and ruminating on those discussions, and then coming up with scripts, one-liners, narrative monologues, things like that.
And the next thing is they start to send you a lot of material. In my case, I was always working on a sequel to a game. So I had to know, for example, for Ghost Recon, I had to know the entire history of Ghost Recon, all the narratives from all the other games, like 15 years worth of narrative material. I had to be the sudden expert at it. So that, it's really cumbersome. It requires a ton of reading, and you're sifting through material all day. And a lot of times they're putting you through this very complex level of security to obtain those materials. Different servers and special passwords and logins and usually some really big files. Maybe they have video documents they want you to watch, and so I've gone through all those. Were taking me like half a day to get actually just obtain the materials, downloading them and cataloging them. So there's that. And then usually in your contract, they'll be really explicit about, we need this material, we want you to work with us for this length of time. They may very well say, we'll expect this number of pages or this, development document by X date. And you gotta hit the date or you're out.
There's a lot of different approaches to game design in terms of formal structures. Starting with narrative is definitely a popular one because there's a lot of people that have great ideas for games, and then leading around the development from that has proven successful in some cases. So if someone starts off with a narrative structure, the first question that comes to the design is can this be an interactive experience, right? Is this a linear experience where we tell as a novel or a film, or is this a non-linear experience or a interconnected hub and spoke? Is it a web? How does it get laid out for someone to interact with the characters and story that's being presented? So starting as a narrative, the game design always is going to rely on what the player does. And so if you start off with a narrative, you have to ask what do the characters do in that space, and what they do is going to directly relate to what design is afforded.
Okay. So the inverse of that, if you start with specifically a game design concept, let's say you have ideas for like an MDA model for your game,
Sure.
how can that end up informing the overall narrative of the game?
Okay, so if you start off with an MDA model, the Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics model by Marc LeBlanc, that's going to say what activities are interesting, right? Starting off with mechanics, what things do the players do that's worthwhile, and those can always be reskinned. The idea of starting with mechanics, going to dynamics, how those things interact, and then the aesthetic, how do we wrap that, right? If I throw a projectile, is that a bullet, is that a bow and arrow, is it a magic spell? Those things can actually be changed through the aesthetic, but mechanically stay basically the same. So when you talk about the narrative, the context in which those things happen, the game design is less informing the narrative as the narrative is conceived by the designers, right? Oh, how could this make sense? How could we wrap this to be interesting? As opposed to the previous question, right? Starting off with narrative, going to game design, the narrative directly informs the game design, whereas game design affords narrative rather than informs it.
Well, and this, I've seen this happen as well, where the storytelling elements are so powerful and so strong that many members of the design team, become very, very passionate about them and don't want them to change until the level designers walk in the room and burst their bubble and say, it's just not feasible, or we can't do that much in this amount of time, or we don't have the budget, or I don't have skills, I've just lost a couple of people, whatever. There's all kinds of logistical issues that can come into play. And so I think that if the game is going to begin with a narrative design, your story, then the writers who are developing that story have to be keenly aware of the assets that they have at their disposal, what the level designers can do, what they may not be able to do. And that's going to require some experience in the industry. So that becomes problematic and it really applies to film as well, where you walk in and you pitch an idea to a TV show and they say, if we produced your episode, that would be our entire budget for the entire season. We need to make 20 episodes or 13 or whatever it is, and year one would cost us all our money because you don't understand production value and how much that stuff costs. So that's probably the biggest caveat, I think, with beginning with story. With beginning with design, then there's some conformity, right? If you're doing a game if you're doing like a Guitar Hero type of game with an input device, well, you're sort of either you can say you're constrained by the input device, or you're going to use the constraints to create some really cool and interesting narrative approaches to using that input device. So, it kind of goes both ways.
A writer, of course, is going to be somebody who is the large umbrella, being able to write anything that needs to be put down into words. But the narrative writer is going to be linking how to develop characters and story, and that again goes through monologue, dialogue, through quotes and things like that. Writers sometimes are going to modify the technical writing, how those dialogue elements are incorporated into a game design document per se. So they're taking things that are heard by the player and writing them in a way that a designer can interpret and compartmentalize them for implementation in the game. And the creative director, of course, is going to be working with all the people along the way, sometimes constructing the writing themselves. Sometimes they're going to be delegating based off of their vision. They're going to explain their vision, explain their intention for characters and story development, and then they let the others develop as their flavor seeps into the game.
In the gaming industry, it tends to evolve out of the company. Maybe a lead designer will come in and have just a razor statement or just a thought, or maybe there's some new innovations with a game engine, and they're thinking, how can we exploit this innovation, this technology, and what best what's the scenario we could create? You know, what's a world we could create that would really allow us to exploit this technology? And so in many cases, the ideas are born in-house, and the writers are brought onto the project and then start to make their contributions.
In conclusion, writing for video games is a complicated topic. Almost everyone has a different thought process and approach. There are similarities and differences to writing for screen or page, but ultimately, what should most inform one's vision and work as a writer is the medium itself, and how it can be effectively used to unique effect.